The first brief lesson is, this morning and this evening, because I've been having a little vocal trouble, I've been not singing. And if you've ever had to do that, maybe you've experienced like I have, it is really hard to sit with you while you're making such a beautiful offering to God of song and not join in and be part of that offering. That's really hard to do. And I never would have thought that it would be that hard, but it is hard. It's not simply because I want to sing, it's because I hear you singing, and what you're singing is to God. It's going to Him as a beautiful offering, the fruit of your lips, and I'm not able to be part of it. That's hard, but I think that tells us something of the spiritual depth of singing itself. It's a marvelous thing that God's given us. The second thing is, if you try to hum, it's just as bad as singing. You might as well sing. So there we go. All right, that's the first lesson. Amen? The second will be a little longer. We're talking about the last part of Mark's gospel tonight, chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. There's been some controversy through the ages about this text and whether or not it should be included, but almost every translation includes it, even though they might include it with footnotes. And you probably had some footnotes, depending on the translation you have. This is, what are we looking at? First I'm supposed to tell you what we're going to be looking at tonight. First we're going to look at the footnotes. That's the first thing. So I guess I'm in order there. And then we're going to look at the points that have been raised against the inclusion of Mark 16, 9 to 20 in Mark's gospel. And then we're going to look at the problems with those points. And then we're going to look at the points in favor of the inclusion of that particular text. All right, the King James Version. If you've got a King James, you're using it, this is the footnote you'll see. Verses 9 to 20 are not found in the two most ancient manuscripts, the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus. Others have them with partial omissions and variations, but the passage is quoted by Irenaeus and Hippolytus in the 2nd or 3rd century. The 2nd century is the century with the ones. 110, 120 AD, that's the 2nd century, because the 1st century is the century without the ones. AD 33, when the church was established, that's the 1st century, but when you get into the ones, that's the 2nd century. And if it's any confusion to anybody trying to figure that out, that's the way that works. It's just like, what century are we in now? 21st century, but does it start with a 21? See, that's not right. It ought to start with a 21 if it's the 21st century. That's just the way I think of it, but that's not the way it's going to do it. So here we are. New American Standard Version, 1960 is when this was first published, has later manuscripts add verses 9 through 20. That's all it has. Later manuscripts add verses 9 to 20. New International Version, first published in 1973, says the earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16, 9 to 20. Then we go to the Revised Standard. Does anybody in here use Revised Standard? It used to be very popular. Okay, Diane's got one. We knew we'd have one oddball here. And sure. This is the footnote with the Revised Standard. Some of the most ancient authorities bring the book to a close at the end of verse 8. One authority concludes the book by adding after verse 8 the following. And then they have a quote of what's added that somebody wrote in there at some point. But they reported briefly to Peter and those with him all that they had been told. And after this, Jesus himself sent out by means of them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. And then they close their footnote by saying other authorities include the preceding passage and continue with verses 9 to 20. In most authorities, verses 9 to 20 follow immediately after verse 8. A few authorities insert additional material after verse 14. All this is telling us is that there has been controversy, and depending on the authorities, and when we say authorities, what we're looking at and what we're talking about regarding authorities are the ancient texts, the Codex Sinaiticus, the Codex Vaticanus, and a codex. Don't let that throw you. A codex is essentially a book. What they would do in ancient times, because they didn't have modern publishing facilities and book binding facilities, they would take paper. You know what a scroll is? That's where you take a long paper and you put a rod at each end that you can roll it up on, and so you've got this rolled up, long piece of paper rolled up, that's a scroll. But a codex was different. They would take pages, probably rectangular, they would write on those, write on the first one, then write on the second one, write on the third one, and then they would bind those in the middle and fold them over, and that would be the codex. So it's essentially a book like we've got, only instead of having a nice broad back like this to accommodate, you can imagine if you take a whole bunch of papers and you fold them over, it's going to be kind of awkward, but that was a codex. And the two most ancient ones are the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus, and they don't have Mark 16, 9 to 20. I'll tell you what this means in a little bit. 3 primary reasons Mark 16, 9 to 20 is questioned. It's not in Codex Sinaiticus, and this dates back to the 4th century, AD 330 and 360, or the Codex Vaticanus, 4th century also. Eusebius. How many of you have ever heard of Eusebius? Okay, Eusebius is a guy who is called the father of church history. He wrote prolifically about the church and everything going on in the church, the doctrines, the heresies, all the big questions he wrote. And you can get Eusebius's church history. It's pretty well-known volume. And Eusebius rejected Mark 16, 9 to 20. And so when people find that out, oh, Eusebius rejected it, well, it must not be legit. Well, not necessarily so. Have you ever read a commentator today that you disagreed with? Oh, okay, yeah, I think that means yes. Even though they might be very studied, very scholarly, very sound in many ways, you just don't always agree with everything that people conclude. Highly respected scholar, Henry Alford, claimed that Mark 16, 9 to 20 contains 17 unusual words and unusual phrases not used elsewhere in Mark's gospel. And that they thought was reason. And why is there a 1 instead of a 3 there? I don't know. Because I'm now using a Mac. I'll blame it on the Mac. I had 14 slides. We're down to 12 because my Mac wouldn't let me save. It used to be easy. You could tell your computer where to save stuff, but now that I've got this Mac, I want to save it over here. But it won't even give me that option. And no, you can't save it over there. It's like, I'd like to get my hands on some, well, I better not get my hands on some technicians because I wouldn't be Christian if I think. Anyway, I better move on here. But this is one of the points they make against it, that there are 17 unusual words and phrases used in that portion of Mark that aren't used anywhere else in Mark's gospel, which sounds like a legitimate complaint. So let's take a look at these complaints. Let's look first at the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus question. Vaticanus does have an uncharacteristically blank space left on 2 pages at the end of Mark's gospel where this text would otherwise appear. So you're reading Matthew, it's full all the way to the end. You're reading John, it's full all the way to the end. You're reading Luke, it's full all the way to the end. You get to Mark, and you read, and down at the end of the last verse, verse 8, where they would leave off, there's a space. I'm doing it again. I can't turn away from my mic on my neck. So that space naturally leads us to believe when we look at it, well, there ought to be something there. What's missing there? It's as if the authors of the Codex Vaticanus knew there was supposed to be something more. I don't know why they didn't have it. Maybe the guy took a coffee break or something, and when he came back, they'd taken it to the publisher. Who knows? That's a joke. They didn't have publishers. The guy who was writing it was the publisher. But for whatever reason, it's not there, but there is a blank space for it. Second point. F.H.A. Scrivener, it's an interesting thing. When you start looking at scholars of ancient texts, a lot of them had 4 names. So if you're going to have a child and you want your child to become a scholar of ancient text, I suggest naming them with 4 different names. F.H.A. Scrivener, undisputed expert in extant Greek manuscripts. The word extant simply means it's still existing. There are some manuscripts we know about because somebody else wrote about them, but we don't have them. We just have what somebody wrote about them, and so we know that other book exists. Just like when we read in Colossians, And at the end of Colossians, it says, I want you to read this letter and then send it to, I got to look now. It's always clear until you get in the pulpit. But there was a letter to the Laodiceans. And he said, I want you to read the letter that I sent to the Laodiceans. But we don't have that letter to the Laodiceans. So we know it exists because it was mentioned, it was described, but we don't have it. This is Colossians 4, verse 16. When this letter is read among you, have it also read in the church of the Laodiceans, and you, for your part, read my letter that is coming from Laodicea. So, there was a letter to the church at Laodicea. God did not see fit to preserve that for us, which is okay, because we'd have to change the song about the New Testament books. We just keep it the way it is. But that's what an extant manuscript is. It's a manuscript that still exists. It's in a library somewhere. You can go and you can look at it, you can handle it, you can read it. That's extant. So he says, against the verdict of the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus, that it's not in there, against that, we can appeal to a vast body of ecclesiastical evidence reaching back to the earlier part of the 2nd century. When would the earlier part of the 2nd century be? That would be the early 100s. So that's just within decades of the establishment of the church and the finishing of the New Testament. It says we can reach back to that part of ecclesiastical evidence to nearly all of the versions. A version is when you take a Greek manuscript and you want to translate that, say, into Syriac, or some other language. Another language would be a version, and he says that there are almost all the versions include Mark 16, 9 to 20. And to all extant manuscripts excepting 2, one of which is doubtful. So he's saying that the greater evidence by far says that Matthew 16, 9 to 20 should be in there. Codex Alexandrinus from the 5th century. So what years would be the 5th century? Excuse me, that would be the 400s. I think I'll just click these and let you guys read them. It does include Mark 16. So, what about Eusebius' rejection? While Eusebius rejects the passage, many other church fathers accepted it as authentic. Maybe you'll recognize some of these guys. In the 2nd century, there was Irenaeus, Papias, and Justin Martyr. In the 3rd century, there was Hippolytus and Celsus. Thank you, brother. I appreciate that.
PJ suggested it.
Oh, well, she's a good suggester. If the cough drop doesn't do it, though, I don't know if anything will. I highly recommend Fisherman's Friend cough drops.
I could have brought you a piece of pie, but I thought that'd be good.
You know, eating does help. Is there any in there? Now I can't focus. I could have had pie right there. So these guys, Irenaeus, Papias, Justin Martyr, they say, yeah, it's legit. Hippolytus, Celsus, it's legit. Aphrodites, Cyril of Jerusalem, Epiphanes, Ambrose, Chrysostom, and Augustine, all of these ancient church fathers said, yeah, it's legit. We think it belongs in Mark's gospel. So just because Eusebius says no, well, look at all the guys that say yes. Eusebius may have been biased against this passage by the Arian heresy, which denied that Jesus was equal with God, as Mark records him ascending into heaven and sitting at God's right hand. That's what Mark records at the end of his gospel. And Eusebius had bought into this Arian heresy, so he may have simply not liked the idea that Mark put that in there because it went against what he thought was the truth. Alford's conclusion about the 17 different words or phrases. J.A. Broadus showed that the same claim can be made for the 12 verses preceding 9 to 20. So if you start at verse 8, and back up 12 verses, you'll find 8. Oh, the same claim can be made for the 12 verses. Boy, it's going down fast, isn't it? Is that any better? No, it's not, is it? J.W. McGarvey noted that what's this invitation song, Bob?
I'll be listening.
I'll be listening. That's too bad. Let me take a couple of breaths and we'll see what happens here. J.W. McGarvey, he noted that Luke concluded, you're bringing me cough drops? I got one in there right there, brother.
Dr. P.J. thought you might use those.
Oh, okay. Is this prescription candy? Is that...
It's fisherman's second friend.
Have you guys read this by now? If you've read it, we'll just move on. That's what we'll do. I didn't want to... Oh, that was the last slide. Okay. I was going to say... Even if we should at some point find out that these verses are spurious... Oh, man. They don't add any new information, so they don't contradict anything in any of the other Gospels. And what these passages do contain is all corroborated in other texts. So what's the big deal? There's no real problem with Mark 16, 9 to 20. Next time you talk to someone and they say, well, you can't quote Mark 16, 16 because that's not really Bible. Are we going to keep this on the record? You come back to this lesson and you tell them, hey, Marty coughed up a lesson there one Sunday night about that. Let's go listen to it. Excuse me. I think I'm done. Let's stand and sing. Lord, love you.